Last time, we looked at the history immediately following the end of the Old Testament. So basically about the 200 years after the Old Testament ends, where it starts with Judea still under Persian control, but it wasn't too long before Alexander the Great comes in, conquers the Jews for the Greek Empire, which after Alexander's death split into 4 different factions, 2 of which ended up fighting over Israel and the Palestine area. So Judea started under the Ptolemaic rulers, which were fairly, easygoing. They didn't really interfere with the Jews very much. But Hellenistic Greek culture was starting to sort of seep into Jewish culture and be integrated into that. So you're starting to get more pagan influences. But eventually, the Seleucids, who were based in Syria, conquered the Jews, and this is where it really started to cause problems. The first few Seleucid kings were okay, but then Antiochus IV, also known as Antiochus Epiphanes, came to power, and he eventually decided that it was his goal to completely destroy the Jews. I think so. Or he wanted to destroy the Jewish religion and basically force everyone to follow the Greek gods. So he took a lot of measures like outlawing the Sabbath, outlawing circumcision, forcing Jews to eat pork and other non-kosher foods. And then for his sort of grand finale, he sacrifices a pig to Zeus inside the temple, which completely defiles it. And that last outrage finally sort of triggers a Jewish rebellion led by a priest named Mattathias. And he and his 5 sons started a rebellion against the Greeks. After only a few months, Mattathias died. His son Judah, also known as Judah the Hammerer or the Maccabee, succeeded him and really started to conduct a guerrilla military campaign against the Greeks. And it wasn't too long after this that Antiochus died battling the Parthians, and his successor didn't really want to be bothered fighting the Maccabees. So he let them have the temple back and relaxed and got rid of the restrictions on following Jewish practices. And so the temple was rededicated, which is where the Jewish festival of Hanukkah comes from. But by that point, they were no longer happy with just getting the temple back and being allowed to practice Judaism again. Their goal was really to drive the Greeks out and gain an independent Jewish state, which eventually they did. Judah was killed in battle, but succeeded by his younger brother Jonathan. Jonathan was later killed, but another one of the brothers, Simon, eventually actually manages to drive the Greeks out of Judea and finally form an actual Jewish independent state, which was the first time that it existed since Nebuchadnezzar had conquered the Jews several centuries before. So that's where we ended up last time. Any questions before we go on? Okay, so now we have, again, an independent Jewish state, starting in the year 142 BC. And Simon Maccabeus, the man who had driven out the Romans, proclaimed himself both the political and the religious leader. He took on the offices of both king and high priest. And again, this was not something that had been God's plan. The role of king and high priest had always been separate. There was a sort of separation of church and state in ancient Israel. Even though it operated under the Mosaic law, the king was not supposed to be the high priest or vice versa. But under Simon Maccabee, he ended up uniting those two. He also continued to expand the Jewish state. If you look in the back, in the maps, I have a map labeled the Hasmonean Kingdom, which shows how the Jewish state expanded under Simon Maccabee and his successors. And you see that Judea, when they first gained their independence, was really just a small area surrounding Jerusalem and Jericho. And under successive kings, it expands out further and further until eventually you get to where it occupies almost the same territory as modern-day Israel. It didn't have the Negev in the south, that southern point. But other than that, it occupies a lot of the same territory and even a bit more. So under Simon, Judea actually expanded up toward Joppa, which on the map is labeled as Jaffa, just slightly different pronunciations. On the coast there, Jaffa, which became the main seaport. So this actually gave them access to the Mediterranean Sea, which they hadn't had under previous Maccabean kings. And the descendants of Simon were known as the Hasmonean dynasty. That's spelled Hasmonean. So the Hasmonean dynasty would rule an independent Jewish state for roughly the next 80 or so years. And they were all members of this one dynasty descended from Simon Maccabee. And most of these Hasmonean kings also ruled as high priest. And again, that was a problem, like I said, because that was not what God had intended, that the king and the high priest be the same person. Also, they did not legitimately hold the high priestly position. They weren't of the right line. They were a priestly family, but the high priesthood had been restricted to specifically the Zadokite family, which was the line directly descended as close as possible from Aaron, the brother of Moses. And the Hasmoneans were not of that line. So they were not legitimately the high priest, but they claimed that office anyway. Now, Simon and two of his sons ended up being assassinated. And after that, Simon was succeeded by his sole surviving son, John Hyrcanus, who ruled from 134 to 104 BC. So had a rule of 30 years. So he had a very long reign, a very prosperous one. And he really expanded the Jewish kingdom outward. Again, if you look at that map in the back, he ended up expanding a great way north and south to encompass most of what Judea had held before. He also expanded east of the Jordan River, which had not been a Jewish area. So he conquered Ammon, and the people who lived there, who were the Edomites, who by this time were being called the Idumeans. So they had been the Edomites. They were called Edomites in the Old Testament. Now they were referred to as Idumeans. But he conquered them and forced them to convert to Judaism, which again was a new thing in Jewish history. Kings like David and Solomon had conquered new areas for Israel, but they had never forced the conquered people to become Jews, to adopt Judaism. But the Hasmoneans did that.
Edom is Esau's.
Yes.
Descendants.
Yeah, Edom is Esau's descendants. So he conquered them, and they were living east of the Jordan, which had not been an Israelite area. He forced them to adopt Judaism. He also took Samaria, which again was the area north that had been part of the kingdom of Israel. And when he did that, he destroyed the Samaritan temple. Remember, the Samaritans believed that the temple in Jerusalem was illegitimate, that they believed that the temple should have been built on Mount Gerizim in Samaria, so they built their own temple there. And when John Hyrcanus conquered them, he destroyed it. And the temple was never rebuilt after that. In fact, much later, in 484 AD, one of the Byzantine emperors, Zeno, actually constructed a Christian church on top of the ruins of the old Samaritan temple, which kept it from ever being rebuilt again and completely destroyed basically whatever remained of it. So we don't really have much in the way of ruins of the old Samaritan temple. It's all gone. So he conquered Samaria. He then went even further north and conquered most of Galilee. Now, we all know Galilee as being where Jesus was from. That's where Nazareth is. But it had been a Gentile region for a long time. Ever since Israel had been conquered by the Assyrians, the Israelites had been deported and other people had moved in. So Galilee, in fact, by that point was known as Galilee of the Gentiles. So he conquered it.
Do we know whose descendants that they were?
Would have been probably other Assyrians and people that the Assyrians had put in there.
And the Assyrians were?
The people who conquered Israel, the northern kingdom. That was Nineveh.
So they were just...
They were another foreign power.
We don't know if they were descendants of Cain or...
Oh, well, no, nothing like that. They were another Mesopotamian kingdom like Babylon.
Okay.
So under Hyrcanus, you get a very large expansion of the Jewish state. And again, as he's expanding, he is forcing people to convert to Judaism. And this would actually be continued by his descendants as they conquered more territory.
So when they forced them to convert, he was circumcising them and then making them go to temple and stuff?
Yeah, he was forcing them to be observant Jews. Even though these were not, Jewish people by ethnicity. They were not people who had ever been under the covenant, had ever been under the law of Moses, but he was forcing it on them. So, again, he ruled for 30 years. After that, his son, Aristobulus, was the next ruler. That's spelled Aristobulus. So his son Aristobulus succeeds him, rules for only 1 year. And he was not a good king. Unlike his father, who was successful in a lot of ways, Aristobulus was basically just a very cruel tyrant. To secure his own position, he kills his own mother and brother. And he also kept both the title of king and of high priest. He conquers more of Galilee. John Hyrcanus had conquered more southern Galilee. He conquers northern Galilee. Again, he forces the people there to convert to Judaism, and to secure the area more, he plants colonies. He takes Jewish people and plants sort of Jewish colonies in Galilee, one of which was Nazareth. Nazareth was sort of a Jewish colony town, which is one of the reasons why the people in Nazareth in Jesus' time seemed to be so zealous. They were very, remember their reaction when, Jesus declared himself Messiah and read from Isaiah. They tried to stone him. Because they were very zealous Jews, because they had been planted there to hold the area for Jews and Judaism. So Aristobulus only reigns for 1 year, and then his brother takes over, Alexander Jannaeus. So his brother Alexander Jannaeus, Jannaeus, comes in, rules from 103 to 76. So again, he has another very long reign. He, like John Hyrcanus, was a very gifted military leader. He also rules as king and high priest. He expands further. He expands northwest to a city named Strato's Tower, which will later become Caesarea, which is mentioned in the Gospels. He expands southwest to Gaza. He conquers the area that had been Philistine territory. Remember, Gaza was one of the great Philistine cities. So he conquers that area and into what's nowadays called the Golan Heights.
Philistine is where Goliath was.
Yes, and the people who were constantly causing people like David trouble. So by the end of Janneus' reign, the Hasmonean kingdom basically occupied just about all of what would be modern-day Israel, again, except for the southern desert, the Negev. That sort of point, if you look at a map of modern-day Israel, it goes down to a point. That lower point there, they didn't occupy. But again, it was all desert. They weren't really settlements there. And they also had expanded to the east of the Jordan River, which is something that had never been held really by the Jews before. So, like I said, the Hasmonean kings, the first few, really engaged in a campaign of expansion on both political imperialism and religious imperialism. They were conquering territory, forcing people to become religiously Jewish. And not surprisingly, this actually engendered a lot of bitterness, a lot of resentment among these conquered peoples. And this is where you actually really first see the rise of genuine anti-Semitism. Up until this point, the Jews had just been sort of one more tribe living there. People surrounding them didn't really care. There wasn't any sort of special animosity against the Jews. But now you actually start to see it. You start to see a lot of these conquered people really resenting the Jews for coming in and forcing them to give up their religion.
These people wouldn't have known the Torah.
Well, they would have. I mean, they weren't Jewish. I mean, they were pagans. But the Jews are coming in and forcing them to convert. So they were being forced to follow, all the Mosaic laws. And so you actually start to see a lot of resentment building up in these conquered peoples. Now, interestingly, even though they were so militantly Jewish, they were not anti-Hellenistic. They actually integrated a lot of Hellenistic, a lot of Greek influences.
So the Hellenistic, that's the word?
For Greek culture.
Greek culture.
Basically Greek culture. Greek culture as it was in this point. It wasn't like classical Greek culture like, Homer and the Iliad and all that. It was more modern Greek culture that, that had been influenced by the Persians and the Egyptians and all these other people. But even though they were very militantly Jewish, the Hasmoneans were also, more and more increasingly Hellenistic. In fact, their winter palace near Jericho had a lot of very, very Greek amenities. It included a large swimming pool, heated baths, frescoed walls, Greek columns, like you see in all the, fancy Capitol buildings and all that sort of thing. So you had a lot of Greek influences, but between the pool and the palace were also the Jewish ritual baths, because the Jewish had their own ritual bathing. So they were really trying to combine Jewish and Greek influences. So at the start, the Hasmonean period really seemed like sort of a Jewish golden age, especially again under people like John Hyrcanus, that really expanded out the Jewish kingdom. But as time goes on, as tends to happen in dynasties, you get more and more corruption, you get more and more laziness. The quality of rulers really begins to decrease. And the amount of tyranny really begins to increase. You have, typical sort of political intrigues, power struggles coming up. And Alexander Janneus, this last one that we talked about, was really the last of these strong Hasmonean kings. And he dies in 76 BC. Now, he was actually succeeded by his widow, not a son. He was succeeded by his widow, Salome Alexandra, who ruled from 76 to 67. And she, because she can't serve as high priest, she appoints her oldest son, Hyrcanus II, as high priest. Interestingly, this is when you start getting rise to people like the Pharisees and the Sadducees. They're starting to develop in this period. And Salome and her son Hyrcanus were very partial to the Pharisees. So,
remind me what year this is?
Salome comes to power in 76. BC, and she rules to 67 BC.
So the Pharisees, they had been around for hundreds of years.
No, not 100, but they were developing. They were really starting to develop at this time.
So they were fairly new when Jesus.
Oh yeah, they hadn't been around. They've been around for like a century by the time of Jesus. They weren't like an ancient Jewish thing.
Okay.
And when we get to Jewish cultural background, we'll go into a fair amount of detail on the Pharisees. So Salome dies in 67. Her son, Hyrcanus II, who again was the high priest, succeeds her. However, her younger son, who is Aristobulus II, contests his brother's ascent to the throne. He thinks he should have it. And now you have civil war between the two. Civil war between Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II. And Aristobulus supports the Sadducees. So now you have the Pharisees and the Sadducees on opposite sides, not only religiously, but of a political conflict as well. Now, this is where they did something really stupid, and it's the sort of mistake you shot to see people always make in history, but they keep on doing it. And that is, they appealed to the Roman governor of Syria, because by this time the Romans had come in, they were conquering the Greeks. Syria was no longer under Greek control, it was now under Roman control. And both Hyrcanus and Aristobulus appealed to the Roman governor of Syria to be recognized as the legitimate ruler. Interestingly, other Jews appealed to that same governor to reject both of them, because neither one was very popular. So this gives the Romans the pretext to have some kind of legitimacy to come in and take over completely. So in the year 63 BC, now here's where the Romans come in and take over, and you get the collapse of any independent Jewish state. So
we're going on to the next point.
Yeah. So any questions?
So before all of this, the Jewish kingdom had become very small.
Well, no, they had expanded out.
Right, no, but you're saying through all of these different Hasmonean kingdoms that kept expanding.
Yeah, well, the first few, it expanded through John Hyrcanus and Alexander Jannaeus mainly.
Okay, so
Before that, it had been very small. When the Maccabees won independence, they controlled a very tiny area. And then you had a succession of kings that expanded outward until they controlled almost everything that, you'd see in like the modern state of Israel.
So they've lost all this land like when they were exiled and all these...
Yeah.
Okay, so then what they kept pieces of it from the original 12 tribes.
Yeah, they kept on sort of reconquering it.
Okay.
And, conquering additional territory as well. Anything else? Okay, so let's see what happens with the Romans. Now, this was not the first dealings that the Jews had with the Romans. During the Maccabean revolt, the Romans had actually been allies of the Jews. Because, again, the Romans were seeking to weaken the Greek Empire because they wanted to take it over. So they were allied with the Jews as a means of weakening the Greeks. Because the the Greeks had supported enemies of the Romans before, so the Romans were really looking to sort of take them out. And in fact, if you read First Maccabees is actually very positive toward the Romans. If you look at 1 Maccabees 8, the first few verses of 1 Maccabees 8 says, "Now Judas, who is Judas Maccabee, heard of the fame of the Romans and that they were very strong and were well disposed toward all who made an alliance with them. that they pledged friendship to those who came to them, and that they were very strong. He had been told of their wars and of the brave deeds that they were doing among the Gauls, and how they had defeated them and forced them to pay tribute. And then a few verses later, it says, "Yet for all of this, not one of them has put on a crown or worn purple as a mark of pride, but they have built for themselves a senate chamber, and every day 320 senators constantly deliberate concerning the people to govern them well. They trust one man each year to rule over them and to control all their land. They all heed the one man, and there is no envy or jealousy among them." Now, if you know anything about Roman history, you realize this is an incredibly idealized view of Roman politics. But because the Maccabees were allies with the Romans, a lot of the Jewish writings from that time were very pro-Roman and, very sort of propagandistic in that way. But so, which, does help you understand a bit, since the Romans had been allies, why both of these Hasmonean brothers would appeal to the Romans to support them. So, but this request allows the Roman access. So the Romans send in one of the most famous Roman generals, a man named Gnaeus Pompey. If you've ever seen the movie Spartacus, he's the guy who fights Spartacus at the end. But he was a very, very well-known Roman general, would later share power with Julius Caesar and someone else in ruling Rome. So he was a very important Roman general. He led his legions into Israel, again, under the claim that he was there to act as a peacekeeper, which, was a fairly common Roman tactic. Pompey supports Hyrcanus, and as the Romans march on Jerusalem, Aristobulus surrenders because it's clear that they can't stand up to the Romans. However, even though Aristobulus himself surrenders, a lot of his followers refuse to give up. They barricade themselves inside the city and inside the temple. So Pompey ends up besieging Jerusalem for 3 months and ends up killing about 12,000 Jews. In fact, the last charge that finally took the city was led by another famous Roman, Mark Antony. He was the one who actually overwhelmed the last defenders in the temple. And during this siege, during this battle, the Romans end up destroying a lot of Jerusalem and a lot of the temple. So now Pompey enters the temple. He even parts the veil and enters the Holy of Holies itself, where in the past was where the Ark of the Covenant would have been kept, and anyone entering it would have been struck dead. But as far as we know, the Ark of the Covenant was long gone by now.
We don't know what happened to it.
No, we have no idea. Indiana Jones notwithstanding. But Antony was apparently expecting to find a lot of treasure inside the central room of the temple, and when he gets in there, he finds nothing at all. So, but even though there was nothing left there, pious Jews were furious that a Gentile had again profaned the temple by entering the Holy of Holies, which again was off limits to everyone except for the high priest on one day a year, which was Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. That was the only time the Holy of Holies was supposed to be entered. And again, it was only by the high priest. But this, again, ends any real pretense of Judea being an independent state. So almost 100 years after Judas Maccabee first won victories against the Greeks, Judea once more falls under foreign control. And it will remain under foreign control until 1948. For 700 years it would be under Roman control, first under the Roman Empire as a whole, and then under the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine Empire. Later it was conquered by the Muslims. A little while it was under control of the Crusaders, but you wouldn't get an independent Jewish state again until 1948. So Judea wasn't even a completely independent province. It was actually absorbed into the Roman province of Syria. So the Jews didn't even have their own province under the Romans. The Romans, even though it was part of Syria, they did divide what had been the Jewish kingdom into two regions, Judea in the south and Galilee in the north. Now, Pompey did allow Hyrcanus II to remain high priest, but he was no longer allowed to call himself a king. Instead, he was given the lesser title of ethnarch, Ethnarch. So he was still a puppet ruler under the Romans, but he was not allowed to call himself king. Notice ethnarch there, you can see the root of our word ethnic. And arch means a ruler, like monarch. So an ethnarch was a ruler over a particular ethnic group under the umbrella of the Roman Empire. Aristobulus, the one who had opposed Hyrcanus, was banished to Rome. Now, only a few years after this, civil war would break out among the Romans between Julius Caesar and Pompey, the general who had conquered Rome, and Hyrcanus sided with Caesar. Even though Pompey had allowed him to continue as high priest, Hyrcanus supports Julius Caesar, which ultimately, of course, is the right decision because it's Caesar who wins. And because Hyrcanus supports him, Julius Caesar did grant the Jews special status within the Roman Empire. And specifically, they were allowed to keep their Jewish religion. Unlike all the other people in the Roman Empire, they would not be required to worship the Roman gods or worship the emperor. They were still allowed to worship Yahweh alone. Interestingly, when you get to the time of the early Christians, that's why the early Christians weren't really persecuted much by the Romans, because the Romans saw them as Jews. But once the Christians became a more obviously separate group, they were no longer under these special privileges, and that's when they started to be persecuted by the Romans for not worshiping Caesar. Because the Jews at this point were allowed out of that, because Julius Caesar, because they had supported Julius Caesar. Questions? What is it, Baron? Okay. She can ask me later.
It would be helpful if you asked now, because I'm sure everybody else would like to know the answer too. That's why I asked questions. Okay.
All right. Anything else? Okay, so now let's look at the Herodians, who were the actual Jewish kings under the Roman Empire. Now, the Romans were, even though they were, very much in charge of their empire, they preferred not to rule directly. They were very smart when it came to this sort of thing. And they realized that most conquered peoples would respond better if they were, quote, ruled by one of their own kind. So, for non-Hellenized cultures, which would have been, like Egypt, North Africa, the Middle East, for those cultures, the Romans usually preferred to set up sort of puppet rulers, vassal kings. So there would be a local king of the Jews, but he would be taking his orders from Rome. But at least gave an illusion of some local independence. And again, this helped to quell a lot of the more rebellious instincts. And people, as long as people could feel that they were being ruled by one of their own kind, they were more willing to accept ultimate Roman control. So, in 47 BC, Julius Caesar appoints a man named Antipater as chief minister of Judea. Now, Antipater was not ethnically a Jew. He was ethnically an Idumean, an Edomite, which you remember had been conquered by John Hyrcanus and had been forced to convert to Judaism. So religiously he was a Jew, but ethnically he was an Edomite. Now, Antipater had been a chief advisor in general to Hyrcanus, so he wasn't a complete outsider. He had been one of the close confidants of the last of the Hasmonean kings. But he didn't last long. He was appointed in 47. He died in 43 BC after being poisoned by a rival. And
excuse me, you said he was the chief minister of what?
To Hyrcanus II, who had been the last Hasmonean king, the one who had supported Caesar. So after just being a ruler for about 4 years, he's poisoned and taken out. So his son succeeds him, and his son is Herod. This is the Herod of the Nativity story. This is the, Herod who historically is known as Herod the Great, but, no Christian would think of him in those terms. But that is usually what he's called, Herod the Great. So he is Antipater's son. He comes to power in 37 BC and reigns to about 1 BC. There's actually some dispute as to exactly the year he died, but he reigns until around 1 BC. Interestingly, after his father was assassinated, Herod actually flees to Rome because, he's afraid they're going to come after him.
And we don't think that Jesus was born at 0, right?
There is no year 0. It goes from 1 BC to 180.
Right, but we don't think that he was born.
There's some debate. He may have been born anywhere between around 4 to 1.
4 BC.
4 BC to 1 BC. Yeah.
So he was, Jesus would have been 3 or 4 or 5 when Herod died.
Yeah, maybe. Again, part of our idea as to when Jesus was born depends on when Herod died. And we're not sure when Herod died. Some people put Herod's death in 4 BC, which is why people say Jesus might have been born in 4 or 5. So it's somewhat uncertain. So Herod flees to Rome. By this point, Julius Caesar is dead, and he's been succeeded by Octavian Caesar, who would become known as Augustus Caesar, and Mark Antony. And Augustus gives Herod the title King of the Jews. And he basically sends him back to Judea to act as the king. Interestingly, before he did this, in gratitude to being given the position of King of the Jews, Herod leads a procession to the temple of Jupiter in Rome and sacrifices to the Roman gods there. So, Herod claims to be a Jew. He claims to be Jewish in religion, but he starts his reign by sacrificing to the Roman gods out of gratitude to Augustus Caesar. So Herod returns to Judea and actually spends the next 3 years fighting for control. Jerusalem itself was held by the descendants of the Hasmoneans named Antigonus. And he was refusing to surrender the city. So he wanted to get rid of the Romans and have a Hasmonean king back in power. And then to get rid of him, the Romans send a general. The Romans besiege Jerusalem for 6 months until they finally surrender. And then from 37 to 31 BC, Mark Antony rules the eastern part of the Roman Empire. And Mark Antony was very much, and Herod was very much Mark Antony's ally. And this is the whole time when Mark Antony and Cleopatra were being allied, and they were attempting to gain control of the whole Roman Empire from Augustus. So there's another Roman civil war happening between Augustus and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. So Herod's very much an ally of Mark Antony in this. However, in 31 BC, Antony and Cleopatra are defeated by Octavian, Augustus Caesar. And Herod very quickly switches sides because he knew how to do the politics. He had been supporting Antony. As soon as he realized Antony was defeated, he travels to Rhodes, 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 which is a city in Greece. That's where Augustus was. And he goes and swears his allegiance to Augustus. Interestingly, he actually emphasizes how loyal he was to Mark Antony and promises to serve Augustus as loyally as he served Antony. So this actually impresses Caesar, and he agrees to retain Herod as king of the Jews. So afterwards, Herod was a very loyal subject to the Romans, even as he was an incredibly oppressive and tyrannical king to the Jews. And in fact, in gratitude, Augustus gives Herod even more territory. So by the end of Herod's reign, he rules over an area roughly equal to that of the kingdom of Israel under David and Solomon, which was the biggest it had ever been. Now, as I said, Herod had been raised a Jew. He had been raised as part of the Jewish religion, but he wasn't a pure ethnic Jew. His father was Idumean, or Edomite, who were descendants of Esau. His mother was an Arab. So he didn't really have Jewish blood. And because of that, many of the Jews saw him as a usurper. They saw him as a foreigner, an Idumean, who the Romans had brought in to rule over them. So, in order to make himself more legitimate, he marries Mariamne, 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 who is the daughter of Hyrcanus II, who is the last Hasmonean ruler. And again, this is a very typical thing for kings to do. When one king takes over from another, he'll oftentimes marry someone from the last king's family to give him legitimacy. So this is what Herod is doing. He's marrying the daughter of the last Hasmonean king in order to give himself more legitimacy as king of the Jews. But most of the devout Jews never accepted him. They were never happy with him. Partly because of his ethnicity, and partly because he really did a lot to promote Greek, Hellenistic culture. He was best known for his building exploits. He built an enormous amount. He built entire cities. He rebuilt the temple. He built himself an enormous palace of his own. And so he gained the title the Great mainly because he was such a great builder. In fact, he built a new port city on the northern coast of Judea named Caesarea Maritima, which ended up being one of the great Roman cities of his time. Its harbor was actually the first man-made harbor in history. And he also built a very complicated, very ornate palace there as well. And as part of this new Roman city, he built a temple to Caesar Augustus. He also built Roman cities in Galilee, Tiberias and Sepphoris, both of which are mentioned in the New Testament. In fact, Sepphoris was only a few miles from Nazareth. So he built a lot of cities, but they were very Roman cities, not Jewish cities. He also built a Roman amphitheater in Jerusalem, where he staged gladiatorial games and other pagan entertainment. Remember, to the Jews, these Greek and Roman amphitheaters, these Roman games were abominations. Not only were they incredibly violent, but they were always dedicated to pagan gods. And Herod was very much a participant in this. So Herod knew that the Jews didn't like him. So to curry favor with them, he rebuilt and enlarged the temple. Now remember, the temple had been under siege multiple times in the last few centuries. It had been rebuilt by the Jews under Ezra and Nehemiah. But now Herod comes, he rebuilds a lot of it, he expands it, and it's possible that his goal was to sort of eclipse Solomon. He wanted to be greater than Solomon, make an even greater and bigger temple.
So is this the third temple?
It's sort of considered part, because the second was never completely destroyed, it's still usually considered to be the second, but it was a huge expansion on the second. And in fact, people usually just refer to it as Herod's temple. He even, to sort of acknowledge Jewish sensibilities, he even trains and recruits priests to do the building work inside the temple so that you wouldn't have non-priests in the parts of the temple where only the priests were supposed to go. Because really the only people allowed inside the temple were priests. Anyone else had to stay out. And his plans were so grandiose that they actually continued long after he was dead. His expansions in the temple took 81 years to finish. He started them in 18 BC. It was finally finished in 63 AD, and then was destroyed completely 7 years later. So his completely rebuilt temple only survived for 7 years. It was so big that some of the foundation stones were 40 feet long and weighed 600 tons. So massive building. And when it was finished, his temple was nearly twice as large as Solomon's.
And this is the one that when Jesus said it was going to be destroyed, each stone removed from every stone.
Yeah. It was also the one that Satan took him to the top of and told him to throw himself down. Because that would have been because it was huge, it was enormous. It would have been a very, very long fall. We only know what this temple looked like because we have very detailed descriptions of it at the time. Because the only thing left now was what's called the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. And in fact, that might not even be part of it. Most likely, that was just part of the retaining wall that was around the temple. It wasn't part of the temple itself. But, you'll usually see a lot of very Orthodox Jews praying at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem a lot. So he was, he did actually gain some favor from some Jewish higher-ups, some of the religious authorities for building this temple. Because he knew the Jews didn't like him, he also built 2 mountaintop fortresses at Masada and Herodium. And Masada, became very famous later as sort of the last Jewish stand against the Romans, and we'll cover that at the very end of the course. So Masada was about 35 miles southeast of Jerusalem on the west bank of the Dead Sea. It included a 3-story palace along with a fortress and underground cisterns to collect water so it could weather a siege. It had its own water supply. Herodium was about 8 miles south of Jerusalem on the edge of the desert. And it was a palace and fortress carved into the side of a 300-foot-high hill. Basically, he leveled the top of the hill, built a walled compound on top of it, including a 5-story tower. So, again, he earned the title the Great from all these different building projects. But, he built a lot of Roman cities which antagonized the Jews. He did expand the temple, but he knew that people didn't like him. He was always worried about rebellion. And so he built 2 massive fortresses along with that. So he's known as the Great for his building, but outside of that, he was an incredibly oppressive, incredibly ruthless tyrant. He demanded total political and religious control. He appointed the high priests. There was no longer, any consideration for them being of the proper line or anything. He appointed the high priest to be whoever he wanted it to be. Usually it was a tool of political patronage. If you were someone who had supported him or had given him money, he'd give you the position of high priest. And to finance all of this building, he, of course, had to level incredibly high taxes on the people. And when towns failed to pay those taxes because they couldn't, he would raze them to the ground and sell the inhabitants into slavery. He ended up marrying 10 wives and had more than a dozen legitimate children. Now, Roman law didn't allow for polygamy, so, he didn't marry them all at once. But he ended up but divorce was very common in Roman society. We'll talk about that later. So he ended up with 10 wives, more than a dozen legitimate children. Very, very bloody person. When he started his reign, he ordered the execution of his wife Mariamne's teenage brother, who had been serving as the high priest. Basically because he knew he was popular, and he was afraid that his wife's brother would be a rival. So he actually had him drowned in the swimming pool of his palace. He killed 2 of his 10 wives, including Mariamne, who was the one who he married to give him legitimacy. He killed at least 3 of his sons, including the 2 sons he had by Mariamne, supposedly on charges of treason. He was always afraid he was being plotted against. And, anyone who was afraid was plotting against him, he would have executed. He arrested and imprisoned many of his subjects. He would imprison them in his fortress Hyrcanus and basically never to be seen again. He'd just imprison them and leave them there to rot. And of course, the thing the Christians are most familiar with, he ordered the execution, the slaughter of all the male children under the age of 2 in Bethlehem when Jesus was born. And, to us that's big, but Bethlehem was a really tiny village. There was probably just a handful of babies, which is why you don't really find mention of it in other sources, but it's very much obviously within his character. Anything he felt was a threat to them, he had removed.
Karen wants to know why.
Basically, he was afraid. He was afraid that someone would kill him because they wanted to be king. So anyone he thought would try to kill him, he killed them first.
He killed the babies because he was trying to kill Jesus.
Yes.
Because the wise men had told him.
Yeah, the king of the Jews was been born in Bethlehem. So he wanted to make sure he killed him because he didn't want someone to threaten him.
Does that make sense? He didn't know which one was, so he killed all of them.
So he was incredibly brutal, but he was a very observant Jew who refused to eat pork. In fact, Augustus once said that it was safer to be Herod's pig than his son. So he goes down maybe as Herod the Great, but is also really one of the worst tyrants in history. Now, later in his life, his health deteriorated severely. According to Josephus, Herod suffered from internal pains, swelling of the feet, convulsions, an ulcerated colon. Yeah, for parents' sake, I won't list out everything. And repugnant halitosis. In fact, if you read the record of his death in the Gospels, he dies because he's worm-eaten. So his health was awful. And, it's clearly was judgment. I think the Bible makes it fairly clear that his health in his final years was judgment from God.
Tell me all about it.
No. Now, Herod knew he was going to die soon, and he did not want the Jews celebrating when he died. So, he had his officials compile a list of several hundred prominent Jews, and he left orders that on his death, all the people on the list be arrested, shut up inside an arena in Jericho, and executed. So, he wanted to make sure that even though there would be no mourning for his death, there would be mourning at his death. However, fortunately, those orders weren't actually carried out when he died. But it's just another indication of the kind of person he was. So, Herod dies at Jericho around 1 AD. And again, that date's disputed. It could be several years earlier, maybe a few years later. And he was buried at his palace at Herodian. Interestingly, his mausoleum was discovered in 2007.
What is the mausoleum?
It's basically his huge tomb. He built a whole building to be buried in. And when that was discovered, they found that about 70 years after his death, his burial box, the stone box he was buried in, had actually been smashed to pieces.
Daddy.
Yes,
Why did
ma'am.
he build a whole building when he died?
Because he thought he was that great. So, but about 70 years after his death, most likely Jewish rebels came in and smashed his coffin. And that is, I think, about all the time we have for today. Next time we'll talk about the Herod's sons who survived and who show up in, books like Acts and the like. And then that will be done. We'll be done with the history for a while, and we'll move on to talking about Jewish culture during the first century. But any last questions?
So will you start the culture like the middle of next?
Yeah, because we don't have enough. We have about 10, 15 minutes of material, and then of history left, and then we'll start on culture. And then we won't do history again. We won't do history until the very end of the course. We'll talk about what happened like right after the New Testament, things like the Jewish wars and the destruction of the temple and the siege at Masada, that sort of thing. That's what we'll talk about at the very end. But between now and then, we're going to be looking at Jewish culture and then Greek and Roman culture. All right. So I will see y'all next week.